All right, I guess we're going now. Sorry about that. We're going to talk today about over-the-counter orthotics and why they're such an important part of a podiatric practice and why they may even be a bigger part in the near future, say 6 to 18 months. OTC orthotics have been around obviously for generations, literally. And luckily for us, those of us that are in either the podiatric practice, the ped orthic practice, or those of us who manufacture OTC orthotics, the anatomy of the foot hasn't changed at all in that time. So what has changed? Well, for one, our understanding of when and when not to use an over-the-counter orthotic certainly has evolved from virtually never using OTC orthotics to the mindset that at one point, well, they're just foam, they're not really going to change anything or do anything, to recently where oftentimes they may in fact be as good for a particular patient as a custom orthotic. Maybe even be better, depending on the indication, depending on the pain tolerance, the experience of the patient with orthotics. So the first question then becomes, why would we use an OTC orthotic versus a custom, which obviously are tried and true. They're going to last a very long time, or in theory they should, depending on the wear and tear the patient puts them through. Well, there are certain indications where we're obviously not going to use over-the-counter orthotics or devices, and that's probably a lecture for another time. But there is sort of a short laundry list of indications where we can in fact use them, whether it's metatarsalgia, pes planus, pes cavus, plantar fasciitis, a simple neuroma. There are a lot of, or generic heel pain. There are a lot of reasons why a patient's going to come into your office rather than go to the drugstore or the pharmacy or the local medical supply store, which frankly, if they're in your office, they probably have already tried. I'm going to use an example, Dr. Scholl's. They've probably used something similar from Dick's, from REI, from the running store. There are a number of over-the-counter options that frankly don't belong in medical practices, simply because they're just not effective at all. And that doesn't make them a bad device per se, but it makes them a bad device for a patient who has an indication severe enough to be in your office. Now, that being said, there are a lot of types of over-the-counter orthotics. Some that you may want to use simply as a temporary device. You've casted the patient, it's going to be a week or 2 weeks. The patient is demanding something or some sort of relief rapidly. We're in a very quick reward society, and they want to feel better that day. That's understandable. So sometimes they are in fact a temporary device. Other times, there are other reasons. Patient perhaps doesn't understand how much better off they'll be with a custom device. We can explain the biomechanics, we can explain the expected outcomes, but in their minds, they're just not justifying the outcome with the potential cost of a custom orthotic, let's say $450. In their minds, they should all cost what a Dr. Scholl's cost in a store. Why is it more than $60 or $70? This is crazy. I'm just trying to get my foot to feel better. Why do I need to spend $450? They don't really understand the science behind it. They don't understand the medicine behind it. They don't understand the biomechanics behind it. And they certainly don't understand the business or the risk that the practitioner is taking. What if it never occurs to them that if a practitioner purchases a custom orthotic and then that orthotic sits for a year? It's not as though you can just quickly repurpose that orthotic, not unless you own your own orthotic lab and really want to take the time and effort to tear it apart and try and save some of the materials and then repurpose them. It's not feasible. But again, the patient doesn't see this. The patient doesn't really have to see that. They just want to know they're getting better as soon as possible. And a lot of times that means an over-the-counter orthotic. Now, again, for some reason, patients, probably because of media, they equate over-the-counter orthotics with a quick fix. Now, sometimes that quick fix can be permanent, sometimes it can be temporary, sometimes it doesn't even happen. And let's look at why it wouldn't happen. Why would a patient not get better from an over-the-counter orthotic? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, it's not rigid enough to support their weight or to support the actions that they do on a daily basis. Maybe they're an athletic patient. Maybe they simply stand all day. Maybe they're a weekend warrior. But for whatever the reason, your over-the-counter orthotic that they've picked out doesn't do the job. And what I mean by that is it's not alleviating enough of their symptoms that they feel it's worth the investment of whatever it is your office charges. Could be $20, could be $100. They don't feel it was worth that investment. And because in their minds, they're comparing it to $400 or $500, which is what we've told them a custom orthotic would and should cost, in that, hey, a custom orthotic could last numerous years depending on the patient, depending on the materials we put into it. And so why is this over-the-counter orthotic not working as well? Because once they've purchased it, the fact that it's literally a tenth of the price is out the window, right? They paid for it, therefore they should get better immediately. So if it's not supportive enough, what do we do? Obviously, we can look and try to find a more rigid orthotic, but then we run into the issue sometimes of what if this orthotic shape, this device, just isn't really working for this particular patient, in that, we've got a single widget, or maybe we have two widgets, and they're both a moderate arch, and this patient is a severely cavus foot. Now, they'll probably tell us that it's nice and cushy and soft under the metatarsals, but they're not really sure what it's doing for their arch, and their arch actually still hurts. So how do we rectify that? Well, the obvious answer is let's give them another device. Okay, easier said than done if you only have a single widget. Now, once we have, or you have the choice of choosing multiple manufacturers, multiple devices or orthotics from multiple manufacturers, then it gets a little easier. But, who wants to stock 88 different styles of orthotics or 94 widths or sizes? I mean, who's got a closet that big or expensive? So we've got to start to narrow it down somehow, right? There's got to be an easier way to right off the bat figure out what over-the-counter orthotic actually makes sense for this patient. And really, as a practitioner, the ball's in your court because they're relying on your expertise. I've never, ever told physicians they're selling a product. Really more, they're recommending, they're prescribing just without a piece of paper, simply because it is your medical knowledge and expertise that they're relying on. And so therefore, whatever device you give them, they're going to sort of hold your feet to the fire and say, does this thing actually work? And if it does, that's great, because that means all that's happened is it did what it was supposed to do. If it doesn't work, what are my options as a patient and as a physician? Where do we meet in the middle? Sort of like we would at a custom orthotic, but at a much lower price point. And it's got to be quick, because from a practitioner point of view, the markup just isn't there, right? If you're paying $14, $15 on average for an OTC and sign up for 50, you don't have an hour to spend on this device, or you may not want to. That being said, the patient also doesn't want to spend another hour in your office when they can be doing other errands or relaxing, or preferably not having foot issues. So you got to go with a manufacturer that has different options. And I don't mean different colors or softnesses, different kinds of foam, because all foams flatten out after a while. And, I always go back to the retail brands that you see in a lot of the big box stores, as I call them, the REIs, the running stores, the Dicks. You'll see a lot of the same brands, and they do a lot of the same things. And there's not too much variation from one end of the line to the other, meaning they're quote unquote high end versus their low end, or this versus this. The reality is price is high, price is low. The reality is in the middle, their shell or lack of shell, it's going to be the same or virtually the same because they're making millions and millions of these things, and it's a safe bet that if you see something in a running store or a big box, or a big, well-known pharmacy, they're not necessarily buying based on quality. They might be. They might have a pet orthotist in one location that likes that particular brand, but the reality is they're buying based on price. They're buying based on the ease of the brand to sell itself, meaning either the patient already knows the brand, are familiar with it, or have friends that have used it. And that's not a bad thing because that means the brand is sold a lot, so there's some value there. But what it really means is it's kind of lowest common denominator, in that if it's a mediocre shell and it's made for a fairly average or healthy patient, then most people should be able to just pull it off a shelf, put it in their shoe, and go jogging away or walking away, whatever they choose to do with it. And they're kind of hoping they come back as soon as possible, not because it didn't fail or didn't work, but patient just figured, $30-$40. I felt good for 3 weeks. I need another pair. And then 3 weeks later, they need another pair and another pair. And the reality is we just can't dispense those in the medical office because it's a poor reflection on the office if we're giving them a product and it doesn't last a certain length of time. And I don't mean 3 or 4 weeks. It's got to be 3-4 months. It's got to be 6 months, maybe 8 to 12 months, depending on the patient, depending on how active they are. Now, there are a lot of things that determine how long an over-the-counter orthotic lasts. The big one is what are the materials, right? We all know polypropylene is used in custom orthotics. It's a reasonably cost-effective plastic that we can thermoform, whether in mass at a factory level or sometimes, we can use other materials and we mold them in an office. But reality is that makes it reasonably affordable. And then we use a pour-on or even more generic foams because you want some comfort, and maybe we use some sort of hardened plastic or thermomolded material for a roof post, and all of a sudden you sort of have an OTC that mimics what a custom device does. And there are multiple brands that manufacture these and dispense to podiatry and orthopedics, and a lot will do big box retail. Some only do podiatrists, some do only podiatrists and orthopedics. But to me, that's not as important as, is your patient getting better or reasonably better for their investment of $40-$50? And on top of that, where's the reason to go back to the podiatrist? All of us, or we should be, most of us who supply you, are hoping that patients come back to your office and need to purchase our product again, whether it's 8 months or 18 months, because we all thrive if your practice thrives. So that being said, how do we choose, again, different styles of orthotics? Who makes a better one? It's hard to say because every manufacturer claims to be the best or the oldest or the most aforementioned. There are a lot of reasons that we could buy a particular type of OTC orthotic. But it really boils down to, what do you want to dispense? In other words, let's imagine if there was a way every one of your patients could in fact get a custom orthotic. Price was never an issue and they never had to wait. Meaning literally out of the box, it was pretty close to what they needed. Well, obviously that's not practical, because we talked about before, when we're using OTC orthotics, whether it's pes cavus, pes planus, plantar fasciitis, metatarsalgia, Morton's neuroma, any of these different indications would usually, not always, require a different shaped device. So obviously a device for a cavus foot shouldn't look like or feel like or be made from the same materials as one for a planus foot. And that's kind of common sense, but it gets lost in the equation somewhere when we assume that since the patient's paying 40 or 50, that we are going to just pick a middle of the road device and hope they don't come back complaining. right? We do this, please don't come back unless you need to buy another one. That's always been sort of the issue behind OTC orthotics is how do we make them as good as we can for as many people as we can, that they love them or at least tolerate them until they fail or start to fail, let's say 8 months, a year down the road, or they actually get better. And better could be forever, and better could be for a year, could be 3 years, could be 3 months. But how do we make them appreciate the quality of the device so that literally that whenever it's time to get a new one, they embrace it and they want to go back to that office. They want to go back to your office and say, I need another pair. They worked great. And it's been 9 months and I want another pair. Rather than, hey, it's only been 9 months, they're not working as well, I want my money back. Something's wrong here. And the reality is, it's almost impossible to guarantee a year, 2 years, 3 years with an over-the-counter orthotic. I'm not saying it can't happen. Certain patients, depending on how active they are, how their body type, the shoe that they typically wear, they might get a year, 2 years, 3 years, but typically it's in that 6 to 12 month range. But how do we justify that? Because while some patients, the price of an over-the-counter orthotic is a drop in the bucket, but however to others, it's actually a real investment with money that they may or may not really have as readily available cash, because most of these things aren't being billed through insurance. They're being paid for with cash. So to justify it in the patient's mind, we almost have to paint an image of, hey, we're going to try and get you as well off as if we made you a custom orthotic, but for whatever reason, between you and your patient, they're not getting a custom orthotic. They're getting an OTC. So any OTC line really should, in fact, have a lot of different devices. It should have a lot of different molds, which are very similar to molds for custom orthotics, except these are going to each be mass produced. All the manufacturers that you see in stores have a few different molds. However, they're very clever and creative with colors and foams and packaging that want to make the patient believe that, in fact, these are all vastly different devices. I can tell you from experience that's just not the case. Oftentimes they're very, very similar. If they were that different, they wouldn't put 6 devices out on a beautiful display and just let the customer come in, pick one, get it, and walk out. Because if they were that different, they'd have a lot of returns. The reality is they don't. They're all very similar and they're all made for very healthy feet. So that goes back to what I said before. If it's in a box store or a big chain of pharmacies or a big chain of medical supply stores, doesn't make it a bad device. However, it makes a device that generally was made for fairly healthy feet. Now, that's not a knock. It's just a fact. They don't want people coming back asking questions about the orthotics they purchased simply because they don't have the built-in margins. If they're buying it for 15 and they're selling it for 25 or 30, they don't want to employ a pet orthist or a podiatrist to stand around and wait for someone to come back with a question where they're only going to net $10. That's not what they're in business for. It's an add-on where they can make a couple bucks and hopefully they sell tens of thousands, and no one ever comes back with a complaint. They just come back to buy more and more and more. And some of those brands sell millions and millions every year. It's an astounding number. That being said, practices don't have the room to stock what stores do. So how do you narrow down what you actually are going to use? It goes back to how you were trained and what you're comfortable with and what types of patients you're seeing, what types of procedures you're doing, and what your protocols are. Really, you should be using an OTC or orthotic manufacturer that has enough really truly different devices that fits whatever your in-office protocols are. And those protocols could be as simple as everybody gets an OTC orthotic first before they get a custom, simply because that's the way I was trained, or that's the way you were trained. Another option could be literally, we give no OTC orthotics unless insurance mandates that we do that before the patient is covered for their custom orthotic, which is in fact becoming a lot more prevalent these days. The only other time, and then you have different protocols that have to do with different indications. So that's where it gets a little more interesting. You know, if you say to your staff, hey, for a flat foot, we're only going to use a rigid orthotic, a very rigid OTC orthotic. That's all we're going to use. Okay, well, that makes it a lot easier because, you know, you're going to have to look for an OTC orthotic that's very rigid. Not every manufacturer wants to make very rigid orthotics for the simple fact that there are patients that don't like them. You know, they're not comfortable the first time you put them on. There are other protocols, depending on indications, where you say to yourself and your staff, we are carrying this device because it's super accommodative. And I don't want any pushback. I don't want anybody who is a quote unquote shuffler complaining these are too rigid and they can't shuffle along comfortably in these. And that all we're trying to do is give a little bit of arch support, a lot of cushioning. Maybe they got some metatarsalgia, or, you know, they've lost some of their adipose tissue under the metatarsals, and we're just trying to make them a little more comfortable. So there, you know, that one in particular is a little more generic, but someone comes in with a planus foot, you know, you've got to have an understanding of what we're going to do to treat that, because it's not always the same. You know, pain tolerance isn't the same. Anatomies aren't the same. They're similar. They're not always the same. And patient, I guess, what the value they put in their mind in over-the-counter orthotics, that's not always the same. That's probably the hardest part, right? We need to make them feel, literally feel, as though they got a custom device, or gosh, this is pretty darn close and this is going to work great relative to what you're paying for it. Because a lot of times when people spend $400 or $500, they have very unrealistic expectations on how rapidly they should get better, or at least the symptoms should subside. Whereas when they're buying an OTC, experience tends to be, they're a little more lenient. You know, the argument, it's a lot easier to make the argument, look, Mr. and Mrs. Patient, we did it your way. We did it the inexpensive way. It didn't work quite to your liking. Maybe now we should look at a custom device. It's a lot easier to explain why expectations weren't met at the $40 level versus the $400 level. And that goes back to, again, saying we can probably get you to alleviate most of your symptoms, if not all, but we can't make those guarantees, or it's hard to make those guarantees face-to-face when they're spending $40, $50. But you really should look at a line, and it doesn't have to be orthotics, but you need to look at a line that does a number of things. They need to have a large breadth of devices. And what I mean by that is not saying we have a device with a med pad, one without. To me, that's not a line, right? That's a generic device that happens to have a med pad. What do we make for a planus foot? What do we make for a cavus foot? How are you going to really address metatarsalgia? How are you going to address radiating heel pain, you know, due to extreme plantar fasciitis? And I don't want to know of or have you start to talk to patients about, this is a good running device. This is a good baseball device, a good football device. That's nonsense. The reality is we all treat the feet to alleviate indications so that they can play whatever sport they want to. Now, it's true that from time to time, over-the-counter devices get put in awfully tight footwear devices. It could be a high heel, it could be a cleat, it could be a running sneaker. There's any number of things that can limit what we put into a shoe. But, you know, it shouldn't be their activity, meaning we should be able to find a device for whatever this patient does, even if it's over the counter. So if it means the patient buys two different devices, They buy a 3/4 length and a full length, or they buy a somewhat supportive but really low profile 3/4, and then a super rigid full length device for their athletic shoes or sneakers. There needs to be an affordable combination where you can make the distinction to the patient that this is in fact why they're getting this single or combination of devices. And realistically, this is what they can expect. And as far as symptom alleviation, it could be modest, it could be most of them, it could be all of them. And the beauty of OTC orthotics is we generally don't get in too much trouble if they're not as good as customs. However, it does happen from time to time that patient comes in and says, hey, I tried this one. It was hitting me in the wrong spot. Couple options. Okay, we can go to a custom right away, which if that's a financial option, we can do that. But if it's not, what's our fallback, right? We can say, here's your money back. I can't do anything for you, which is, by the way, a terrible option. You don't want that patient looking in Dick's Sporting Goods or looking in RAI or the running store and self-diagnosing, because the reality is they can find anything, any piece of foam, put it under their arch, and biomechanically speaking, if they've got plantar fasciitis, which is an overuse injury, they're going to get some modicum of relief. And if they believe that it's worth whatever they paid, you may have lost that patient, sans surgical needs in the future. But if they feel they can self-diagnose because we didn't give them the right over-the-counter device, that's a problem, right? We need to have a fallback. We need to have another type of device. Doesn't mean we have to stock 1 million of these things on the shelves, or even 100 for that matter, but it does mean we at least have to have access to them. So whether it means, the Orthotics Ultra because you want a very rigid device, or you want a really, really deep heel cup, you want a lot of rear foot motion control, and you want to use our Max device, which gives the maximum rear foot control. That's up to you, and that's between you and your patient. But you need to have that fallback for the simple reason that when we're talking again about OTC orthotics, that patient needs to know, they need to believe that what they're getting for their money is just about as good or as good as a custom orthotic. And the only way that's going to happen is simply if we give them a really good value, a really good OTC or device at a really good price. Now it has to be a price where the practitioner turns a healthy profit. Otherwise, why invest in this? But at the same time, we are in the business of getting patients healthy. And they need to see those results. Maybe not day one, but again, we are in instant gratification society these days. And that's kind of the beauty of having a backup OTC or a third option at OTC. Whether you want to use 3 different manufacturers or, invest, in a couple of orthotic styles and have 2 or 3 styles. So you always have that fallback. Maybe you use our slim device or a low pro for males and females that say to you, look, part of my uniform is a dress shoe or at least a casual shoe. I can't wear sneakers all day. And I don't have, my Bostonians don't have a removable insole, or my ballet type shoes don't have removable insole. So we need a really low profile device. It might be 3/4. It might be something to offload the metatarsal pain of high heels. It might just simply be a really, really thin full length device for a men's Bostonian or dress shoe. But we need to have those options. Not everyone can wear sneakers, but that same patient may in fact want, if we've done our job explaining what their particular indication is, they may say to you, but I want that rigid full length orthotic for my tennis shoes. I want that higher arch for my pes cavus, for my sneakers. You need to have that option. Simply only because in this time and age, patients, practices are holding, we need to all hold on to our money. Things will get better, but I'm not that person to go into that conversation. But for the time being, 6 to 18 months, how do we treat these patients? How do we keep them coming back? How do we keep them trusting in us? and sort of believing we got their back when it comes to orthotics and the health of their feet, or the ability, their ability level, their activity level to increase because of the OTC orthotics we gave them. With Orthotics, we manufacture 32 different styles. There is no office or nobody in the world that would stock anywhere near all those. However, a lot of practices will take a long look at anywhere from 1 to 3 different styles. Again, you might believe in only custom orthotic type, meaning you want rigid, rigid, rigid. That's fine. We have those. You might want accommodative devices for a number of reasons. It could just be you don't want too much pushback from patients. It might be, simply put, you want to make them comfortable because they will never be able to afford a custom device. Or you might want a combination. You might need some of both. It might really depend on the indication. You might stock a very rigid device and then a slightly less rigid device. And then the third device could be something like our Freedom, which is for neuropathics or diabetics that don't qualify for the shoe bill. It's got a very flexible plastic shell. It's got a very, very low density top cover, which a lot of patients will like because it gives them that soft, squishy feeling, but in fact, there is a shell to give them support. They may, in fact, just want a generic device like our Comfort because they stand a lot all day and their feet get tired. And by putting them in, maybe now their feet don't ever get tired, or they don't get tired at 4:30 instead of, 9:30 a.m. They can make it 90% of the day. And oftentimes that's enough for a lot of patients, especially asymptomatic patients, or what I like to call asymptomatic, in that if we're giving a basic foot exam, we just need, we're not going to find anything other than tired, sore feet and some complaints, perhaps of tightness in the arch or plantar fascia, but nothing that's really would require a custom orthotic, certainly nothing like a surgical intervention. So again, we need to find 1 or 2 or 3 ready orthotics, whether it's a Max with a deep heel cup, a rigid ultra, sort of the all-purpose Comfort, or maybe it's a 3/4 length device that fits most of our patients. And then you sort of have a second option that fits, the last third. And then the nice thing about Orthotics is you can always order at no extra cost a onesie or a twosie, because there is a patient that sort of falls outside your normal bell curve of indications or activity levels, and therefore they need a separate device. So we've got 32 devices. Chances are we're going to find 1 or 2 that fit every protocol. And that leads me to another direction. We're talking about protocols. Not everyone wants a big brand name, right? Like a lot of people know Power Step and they know Orthotics, and they know there are a lot of other brands out there in the podiatric field, and they're all really good. But not everybody wants those devices, for the simple fact that they're afraid that after they dispense the first one to the patient's going to look online, and let's face it, everything finds its way online these days. I don't care what a manufacturer says, it's impossible to keep something off eBay. Now, having a single pair or 2 on eBay is not the same as someone saying I've got 28,000 pairs for sale on Amazon. Those are 2 entirely different things. And patients don't know the difference, so they're easily misled. A lot of these things are used, they're not the real product. But a lot of times, you may not want your patient going online and finding a price, that's lower. Now, obviously, if it's more expensive, that it makes you look like a hero. As a practitioner, our goal is to again, it was all about value, right? We want to have the best result for the best value. So if they can go online and find that exact same device for less than you dispensed it for, it can get sticky, or they may just not come back and buy another one. On the other hand, if it's more expensive online, if you're selling a device for 40 to 50 and it's $60 online, no harm, no foul, right? They found it online, but at the very least, the practice comes off looking in a very good light here, in that you weren't trying to take advantage of a patient, right? You were trying to help them. You did your good deed for the day. You give them a break. I can't tell you how many calls we get every day where patients will call us and we quote them. We tell them in their Ready Orthotics are 60 plus shipping, so expect about $70, where we get a rude answer, or they simply say, I'll go back to my doctor. Because frankly, if we're selling them for more, or they're online for more, then you come off in a good light. And that's what we all want. We're talking about orthotics. What adds value? So when a patient, is thinking about purchasing Ready Orthotics, what adds value? Well, it's the fact that there's a million different styles, or 32. It's not the name Ready Orthotics. Patients don't know that. Certainly, if they've never been in your office, they wouldn't know Ready Orthotics. They wouldn't know Power Step. Well, they might know Power Step, but they wouldn't know Ready Orthotics or the other brands. So the reality is you don't have to have our label on an orthotic to make it just as effective, right? We manufacture almost every one of our styles blank on the top, right? So it's just generic device in a plastic bag. If you're inclined and you want to market your practice, in fact, we now offer private labeling. We can put your logo or information or both on a device. We screen print it so it looks professional, it looks like it's a real brand. If the quantity is there and you desire, we can even design new orthotics. We're the manufacturer. So if you said, hey, I love that DPL cup of the Max, but I don't want it in black. I want a neon green or a yellow or a purple. I want a built-in Met pad. We can do that. It's going to take a lot longer process. It's a lot longer process, but it's doable. But no matter what you want to do as far as OTC orthotics, whether it's what style, whether it's what's your protocol, whether it's what your marketing budget look like, do you want to put a private label on? Or is it just easier to order as you need? You need to have some sort of protocol that your entire office can follow. And we think Ready Orthotics can be a big part of that. We are going to offer, positive outcomes, really, really great margins on your purchases. And on top of that, you can always swap out product. So you tried 3 styles, 2 you can't keep in stock, everybody loves them, and 1 you can't give away, just call us. Even a year later, call us. We'll just take them back. We'll swap them, or we'll just give you credit. But either way, give us a call or contact us, 877-740-3668, or customer support at ready-orthotics.com. Thanks so much. Have a great